Now, let me introduce then our presenter of the overview discussion, Ms. Mariana Carolina Silva Zuniga, who is a senior infrastructure finance specialist with the Global Infrastructure Facility. She began her career in investment banking in Hong Kong and recently transitioned into the policy arena. She has been an infrastructure finance expert for BBVA, the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, and now she is with the Global Infrastructure Facility at the World Bank, where she provides technical advisory services to governments in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. This process, she focuses her expertise on infrastructure asset capitalization, project finance for PPPs. So Mariana is going to be talking about a toolkit that has been prepared by the World Bank on how to mainstream climate solutions, on mitigation and adaptation, but more importantly, a lot of these climate solutions are frontier technologies that are being developed, and therefore the publication that PIAF, the IFC of the World Bank, and the Global Infrastructure Facility have put together is just exactly the kind of overview presentation we want to see. Mariana, thank you so much for joining us. Please.
Thank you very much, Eddie and Victoria, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here today. And I think that it's crucial that the topic of today is innovation. We used to say that PPPs were the innovation that we needed, the silver bullet. Now we understand more that the PPPs is just as good as we negotiate the contract and how we're going to put the KPIs and the right risk sharing. So we felt the urge together with IFC and PIAF to create a toolkit that will guide all PPP practitioners, governments, and different stakeholders also from the private sector to see how do we really mainstream climate mitigation and adaptation innovation through PPPs. So I'm going to present you a little bit of overview of what this, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Infrastructure Facility, we are an initiative created by the G20 to solve one key issue in the market back in 2014, which is very relevant today, which is the lack of bankable pipelines of climate resilient projects that they're suitable for private sector investment. So we do not finance projects, we provide all the funding for project preparation. So we're at the core of how do we mainstream mitigation and adaptation innovation. So if we go to the next slide, please, thank you. I wanted just to give you an overview of why we created this climate toolkits, what they're meant to do, and how we're doing this on the ground with a different pilot. So if we look at the PPP life cycle, we think about from the moment where a project is identified to the moment where the project is tendered. In the meantime, there's many aspects that we need to consider to really do a resilient and low carbon project that is suitable for private investment. So the guide provides how is my project aligning with the climate policies from my country, my NDC, to the Paris alignment, now the MDBs globally, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, all banks, we have signed to the Paris alignment methodology, which really forces us to look into how my project is aligned to the commitments of the Paris alignment. So it really provides guidance to the users from the government and the private sector of what does that mean for the project. Then, very important, very, very important, it allows for climate risk screening. What does that mean? Where is my project sitting? What type of climate hazards am I exposed to? And how is my project vulnerable to those climate hazards? And then, relevant to this conversation, what type of innovations are there and best practice in the market that I need to adapt in my project to make sure that it's resilient? Then finally, decision-making process, it provides guidance to the user of how to better allocate risk, who should be more suitable to each thing, and each risk, and then really provides best practice. Then finally, I think that greenhouse accounting, it's a crucial part of mitigation, and it provides really best practice on how to do that. Then finally, climate KPIs. At the end, the PPP is just as good as the contract itself. So what type of KPIs, output best performance specification, can we put there to really make it resilient? And I just want to make sure that we are on the same page saying, like, with climate scenarios, force majeure in a PPP is no longer a best practice scenario. I think force majeure in many countries, just like the example of Colombia, we have reached certain threshold that we now see climate scenarios more recurring, that we need to be more specific about the different climate scenarios and what the implication is and who is the party better to bear that risk or what needs to be insured. So that KPIs from globally that we have collected really gives the strength to the countries to identify what to put in the contract. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just clarification, we're all here are very familiar with PPPs, but just for those of you, we really are looking for those PPPs where there's a significant risk and investment sharing between the public and private sector. So really, if we go to the next slide, we really look into the type of connection at the contract level, and we go into the nitty-gritty as GIF, as PIAF. How can we better act as an owner's broker to the government to help them negotiate more value for money? Meaning, what do we need to put on the OMM contract to make sure that the project is going to fulfill all the expectation from the lender side? If the project is going to be resilient, is there any mechanism innovation in the terms of financing structure, financing mechanism that could help us create a better interest rate for the projects? So we really look at all the contract mechanism that a PPP structure presents to see how mitigation and adaptation could help as well, helping the business case of the project. In terms of PIAF and QII, we start with this toolkit providing guidance on the planning, the development, the initiation, and then on the GIF, we really provide advisory on the feasibility, the value for money, the financial model, the demand analysis, and looking into how do we mainstream that. So if we look into the next slide, I want to already go into what this toolkit, how is it structured? We started with an umbrella toolkit, which it meant going through the life cycle and providing guidance on phase one selection and the appraisal, on the structuring, on et cetera. We put it to the market. We've tested in multiple regions in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And we received the feedback from our client countries that we really needed to do sector toolkits. Why? Because the more nitty-gritty, the more detail is KPIs to a specific sector, the more relevant was going to be for them. So as a second stage, we launched different sector toolkits, ROSE, ICT, renewable energy, which is solar and wind, water, and hydropower. And we're very pleased to say that we really collected a lot of best practice across all MDBs and also the private sector to make sure that the innovation was captured in those sector toolkits. So if we go to the next slide, I can give you a little bit more detail of really what each model covers. The first one looks into how do we map this into my climate policy. The model 2 is climate consideration in project selection. So really, what is the aspects of my project that I need to look in? What are the climate risks? How do I even do a climate risk assessment? And how do I embed strategies to the road that reduce that climate risk? Again, I want to emphasize it provides as well examples and best practice through innovation. And then finally is how do I quantify my greenhouse footprint of the project? That's a key component because that is going to let us know if my project is Paris aligned or no. And what are the strategies to reduce greenhouse emission in every specific sector and subsector, because that will help us prioritize the strategies that will make the project more compliant. Then the 3 is really where everything comes together. And I want to emphasize the importance of this on looking into climate in terms of project economics. How is everything that I'm doing affecting my cost benefit analysis? And how everything that I'm doing in terms of strategy and mitigation and innovation affecting my value for money. At the end of the day, it's a PPP. At the end of the day, it needs to be bankable. And really, it needs to be tested in a way that when the project goes to market, we're going to be able to attract the best private sector project developers and financiers. So it really needs to make sense from an economic point of view. Then finally, model 4 really presents all these KPIs that can be incorporated at the contract level that I will now present in future slides. If we go to the next one, please. Let me go and give you an example specifically for the transport sector to give a little bit more flavor to what I've been presenting so far. If we go to the next slide, please. The integrating climate change consideration to reduce climate footprint of roads while promoting resilience have a lot of best practice of different projects. What we did here is not put examples that they're just hypothetical. We really incorporated a lot of case studies of cases that have worked so far, of solutions that they have value for money, that they're cost efficient, like swells, replacing conventional drainage, high efficiency solar powered traffic lighting, low maintenance bitumen, dedicated lanes for electric transport, and low carbon pavement for increased drainage. So you could say that all these are cost-efficient solutions, like low carbon porous pavement for increased drainage. It doesn't have an increased capex of a project. It's just a matter of being able to identify those solutions since the inception of the project, when the planning is incorporated, when the design stage, because one of the key issues of sustainability in general is being able to do it from the offset. If we do it too late, then yes, it could increase cost, but it's about really having access to everything that is best practice, so we're able to do it since the beginning. If we go to the next slide, and we looked at not only from the mitigation aspect, from the adaptation, if we think of a highway, a transport sector, we know that there are different climate hazards that they're impacting roads, from flooding, precipitation, that it's a recurring aspect that we're seeing in most of our countries around the world, from the coastal roads that they have tidal waves and storm surge, wildfires, that they can do operational disruption of road networks, and there's tree fallings, deteriorating driving condition and accidents, coastal erosion. All these are impacts on roads that, even though, yes, they're a climate threat and a climate impact, if we're able to really be aware that these are things that will happen in the life cycle of the project, in the 30, 20-year concession, we're able to do a more, better design, and B, a better plan in the PPP contract of what happens if any of the circumstances arise. We know that force majeure, as I said, is just something that you could say, okay, if there's any weather-related disruption, there will be the force majeure clause. But I think we're moving into putting more specific operational performance, right? This innovation that we're seeing, and a lot of PPPs coming, new ones, then that we can say, okay, maximal hourly rainfall will be millimeters per hour. The max wind speed, if that scenario happens, the recovery time will be 90% functionality of the network's hours per day. So we're asking the private sector to have operational preparedness based on frequency of preventing maintenance action, time elapsed between a predicted event and a warming announcement. So now we have condition of like, not if happens, because with climate, we know it will happen, but what are the operational performance and innovation that we're seeing in PPPs to make sure that we're measuring functional recovery, emergency protocols, and oftentimes also building redundancy to the network system to make sure that if there's any climate event, we know that we can measure damage and traffic disruption and have clauses to make sure that we can operate at the highest efficiency. I have a great example for you, because we actually implemented this toolkit in Maputo in Mozambique. When we were advising the government for a large road project in a metropolitan area urban mobility project, we were able to finance and fund some can you go to the next slide, please? Some extreme heat and methodology for analyzing where were the flooding analysis. And with this simulation, we identified that if the project were not to do anything, were not to do an analysis of how to better have redundancy in the network, how to include KPIs and etc., the cash flow would be affected as 3.1%, right? So I think that when we talk about climate, before we looked at climate resilient, like an added cost to the project, maybe as a burden. And now we know that if we ignore it, that's the actual burden to the project. It's going to impact the cash flow. It's going to increase the operating cost, resulting in the decrease on cash flow. And by simulating this and identifying what is the impact of annual flooding in the road network and the mobility projects, we can know now in which areas are the most risk nodes, where it needs to be added redundancy or done in a different way. So the key findings on the project was really about how we increase the bankability of the project. It's now a very successful project and went to tender. All the KPIs were incorporated. So I think that having that value for money being achieved for the government through the innovation to add resilience to the project was a key success. And we're very happy that this toolkit is not just some hypothetical document, but really being implemented on the ground. I'm going to be brief and tell you another example about wind and solar, because I'm also very excited to hear from our other very renowned experts on this panel. I choose specifically wind and solar because when we think about renewable energy, immediately it's a project that we will check the box and we say, this is a project that is 100% climate smart, climate resilient, and et cetera. When the reality is that wind and solar also need a lot of innovation in terms of adaptation. If we go to the next slide, we can see a common problem that we're seeing for wind turbines. They're getting frozen, and therefore it affects the functionality, the operating cash flow, the bankability of the project. So we cannot assume that because our project is 100% good on mitigation, it's going to be performing well, because ignoring the adaptation components. So wind is also very susceptible to extreme wind speeds for obvious reasons, because the high stress of the blades and the foundation of on the turbine causing potential damage. The fires, there's a lot of physical damage to the power facilities and transmission distribution equipment that has occurred so far. The freezing, the changes in wind potential, of course, the supply of wind parks, decrease of power outputs during prolonged periods of low wind, and temperature increase. This reduce the air density and may reduce the power production. This is something that now is very well documented, we know. So how can we innovate to the next technology to make sure that the blades are always operating at the highest potential? There's a lot of best practice out there of where do you position your project? How do you do it? Which technology? And again, we wanted to make this all available through this climate toolkit to our users to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, but giving the most innovation out there for onshore, the equipment, the blades, the type of solutions. There's also something that I want to make sure that I emphasize, that we did a deep analysis into nature-based solutions for resilience. Why? Because the solution is not always built more concrete to find a resilient solution. It's always about finding the solutions that we have out there based on nature. There's eco-friendly score protection. There's, instead of like seawalls, mangroves, there's a list of a lot of nature-based solutions that they are a part of the innovation. There's not the only solution that we can have. It's all sometimes green and gray, but it's something that we have to make sure that it's advantageous. And more importantly, sometimes nature-based solutions is criticized because it's really not feasible from the financial point of view. But let's just remember that nature-based solutions are not a standalone project, right? They're always a component of a larger infrastructure project. So the guide also provides guidance on how do you model your analysis in a way that your cost benefit from nature-based solutions can incorporate it into your overall financial model. It's not about just looking in isolation. It's about looking at the infrastructure as a system. And that really changed the perspective on the financial feasibility of nature-based solutions. I wanted to also emphasize that there's climate impacts on solar projects, of course, the breakage of transmission lines, the prolonged power outages, the extreme heat also can affect it, the wind. So there's a lot of impact that could create insufficient of solar parks output to cover the increased energy demands. We also have to be very aware that the changes in temperature reduce the performance of PVs. There's a lot of innovation going on with the solar panels per se. There's also different ways of making sure to increase the productivity of solar PVs, identifying the right location, identifying the right performance of the O&M cost, how do we operate in maintenance, and something that it's low and simple solutions, if they're not incorporated in the contract, is going to be difficult to implement. There's some example indicators. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I'm giving you the flavor of what you can find on the toolkit. If there's going to be reduced loss and disruptions, there are climate-related energy yield losses, quick recovery, time repair, physical damage, right? These are the type of KPIs that we can put on the contract to make sure that the private sector is going to fulfill the needs based on any scenario where we are experiencing climate hazards. Identifying the ratio of maintenance work completing versus plan, making sure that the PPs are being monitored and maintained. It's one of the lowest hanging yield to make sure that it's operating at highest performance. Again, I want to emphasize that we implemented the toolkit in Madagascar for a PPP mini grid for electricity and digital service expansion. We did an analysis on all the climate hazard that the entire project was being exposed to, and identified the requirements and KPIs to be incorporated in policy bid and contracts, and then in the tender documents. And it was successfully bid. It reached financial close, and it's still operating at a very high efficiency. Again, I want to emphasize it's very important to identify all this at the upstream stage to make sure that we are better suited through incorporated innovation at the beginning. So with that, I'm going to put you the next slide. This is the QR for the climate toolkits for infrastructure. It includes the link to the hydropower, renewable, water, roads, and ICT. And I want to do an invitation to all the audience to contact us if you want to implement it on your project. We're here to support you, and we have the funding to make sure that the projects are better prepared. And we're very happy to be here. Over to you, Eddie. Thank you so much.
Mariana, thank you very much for the presentation. And I want to confirm there have been a few questions in the chat room that they want to get a copy of the toolkit. So we are going to be distributing to all of participants and all registered participants the links of publications that are mentioned in today's conversation, but also background reports and background blogs that are potentially of interest to all of you. Mariana, a few questions that come up from your presentation. So any practical cases where you see that the KPIs on adaptation have led the bidders to incorporate new technologies? Because I really like the fact that you are not looking technology-based approaches, but you are looking at KPIs that force innovation. What have you seen in the market in terms of examples? Is that really driving innovation and adoption of new technologies?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for that question. Yes. We, for example, the one that I share in Maputo with the Metropolitan Area and Mobility Project, I would say that it drove innovation in the way that the KPIs were incorporated into the PPP in terms of like what the private sector needs to do in case of a climate hazard. I wouldn't say that changed the technology used by the bosses. I don't know if I'm making myself correct. There's innovation in the hard infrastructure on the technology, and there's innovation in the way that the problems are going to get solved. This PPP, I think it drives innovation in the way that the KPIs are incorporated for an action to occur versus the innovation on the buses. But yes, we're seeing it across all the PPPs that we're advising.
And I think that you are emphasizing two important dimensions of new technologies, because it's not only new physical technologies, but also new technologies for better operation. So what we are beginning to see in terms of early warning systems and how that can be translated into better performance of the PPP services is one that is soft infrastructure, but is equally fundamental for this process.
Correct.
Now, when you're looking at KPIs and you're setting up KPIs in the PPPs, in the design, have you seen worries or discussions to say maybe these KPIs will become too lenient, too soft, because 5 years down the road, a new technology is going to come in, and then the operator is going to get a windfall from that technology? Any discussion on how to handle technological changes that can radically improve the PPPs, but the benefits are not shared?
Absolutely, Eddie. Again, great questions. I think in terms that's a key conundrum that we experience in all PPPs, right? Even without this climate toolkits, even without the climate thing, on the solar PVs, as you presented in your initial slide, there's always a risk of technology. I think something that I have seen in my career when I did a lot of structuring for Africa, I saw clauses in the PPP contract that would allow to retrofit some of the technology to upgrade the panels because, again, you have to do your cost benefit analysis in a way that is your investment to new technology is going to lead to the financial viability of the project, even though it increases the capex at the mid of the project, or you just continue and have the loss. I think that it's important that everything is looked from the economic point of view. What is going to be viable for the project and what's going to be feasible. I haven't seen so far, Edie, on wind and etc., something that will allow the private stakeholder to change completely the technology. But I think as we look into the new scenarios, I think it's something that we should be looking at.
Sure, and vice versa, the case that I described in Morocco, where actually the technology that they were expecting to put became more expensive than others, and then you need to do the contract rate negotiation, is an example of how you really need to incorporate this into the PPP transactions. I really appreciate also the emphasis that you had on nature-based solutions as new technologies, because they are not new technologies, but there are new ways of using nature for this process. And I think that when you're looking into this, it becomes really critical for being prepared for to deal with rapidly changing climate. But I think that it's been interesting, and what we see in a lot of PPPs is that the operators tend to be way too cautious on applying a combination of gray and green solutions, and where even though it may look more economical and actually a better insurance policy because nature can help you with a buffer, there's still a lot of uncertainty and engineers don't feel as comfortable with that process. Is that your impression? What trends are you seeing on the use of nature as a new way of enhancing the resilience of PPPs?
Great question. I think that we're seeing is a little bit of reluctance based on the engineer because an engineer knew exactly how certain material will behave over the entire life cycle of the project. They will know exactly how to measure and etc. Nature is a great source, but it's a little bit less unreliable than other materials that they have used. We actually did a very detailed market sounding with the biggest engineering firms, try to understand like how is the use and etc. And the underlying reasoning was like we not tend to use nature-based solutions is if it's not asked specifically on the tender, because that adds risk at our project, right? We don't know, or the maturity of a nature-based solution to reach maturity to provide the service. Let me give you the example of a mangrove, right? For coastal protection, you need to wait for the mangroves to grow. So they will say, if we need the solution for coastal protection at the moment that we're building the project, we build a seawall. That's it. We measure it. It's there. We deliver. The mangrove will take longer. So I think that if it's not incorporated on the tender, they would not be reactive to incorporate it by themselves. But I would say that's something as well that we receive a resounding positive on all this market sounding that we're doing with engineering companies, but also project developers, is that the more a project discloses information about climate hazards, the more comfortable they feel to bid, because that means that the government has already done a lot of analysis of what will be the climate scenarios with the impacts, and then they can better adjust, and the private sector can innovate, right? But let's just be very honest. Some of this climate hazards analysis, especially for an entire road network, and they're very expensive, right? The GIF, the PIAF, we provide funding to the government to be able to do that, but these are very expensive studies that the private sector, when they're bidding in every project, they're not going to do for every project that they bid. So having that information gives them a lot of information where they can innovate and find solutions if the governments are putting out that data. So I think that's a very important aspect.
And I think that you just raised an important point on the new technologies for PPPs, because we have been focusing a lot on the technology for the PPP operation. But you showed, for example, in the case of Mozambique, that new technologies for the design of the PPP operation, for the incorporation of climate variables, and actually one of the frontiers that actually is affecting PPPs is that their time frame of 20, 30, 40 years means that that's when a lot of the climate change is going to happen, and
Correct.
You have a lot of uncertainties around that. We don't know whether we're going to end up at 1.5 or 3 degree warming, and that has tremendous consequences in terms of the operation of the PPP. So I do recognize, and I'm sure that you're seeing a lot of changes on the use of new technologies for the design of the PPPs. Any reflections on that part of the PPP transaction and new technologies?
On the technologies of the innovation of the hard infrastructure per se?
No, on the design phase. What are you
Yes,
seeing? How are you seeing
for
our
sure.
clients receptive? You mentioned the cost, but any other reflections on how important they are?
Yes, I mean, we're absolutely seeing a much more emphasis on the design looking at resilient that we did before. It actually has been a high ramp up also with the MDBs giving a signal that we're Paris aligned. That adaptation is part of that. And now helping a little bit more the clients whenever they're designing the project, A, identifying what are the climate hazards, and B, how do we can make it better with solar and wind, of course, now with the frozen risk and the like, they're doing different designs for water projects. We're seeing a lot of innovation in the water sector, not only for the exposure to the project to droughts, but also for lack of droughts, for desalination. I mean, there's a lot of innovation out there, Eddie.
Fantastic, Mariana. Thank you very much for the presentation and this exchange. We really appreciate waking up so early in Washington, D.C. and connecting with us.